Not really. There's a little sweet stuff, you know, when you sit down
and see it when you come over.
Yeah. I bet it pops up.
Yeah. And they burned 1,000 acres, 8,000 over by Bayside. That's what the burned. And the wind was blowing straight from there to Corpus.
Oh, that's what that
Town
smell
was
was.
falling.
Oh, was that the Francis Wildlife?
I don't know. They said near Rockport, but they didn't specify.
I bet this Francis Wildlife is when we drove up there for that hunt. They had, you could see that one big forest there. Black River. Could have been a good day yesterday. Whoa, you almost lost it there. Pick it up off the floor, 5 seconds. Yeah. No. Yeah, no, it was on the right. Yeah. Some people get really offended if you put it in the wrong place.
I forget which verse dictates that.
Yeah. But it's the first prayer, so it goes on.
Well, we're probably going to be late all day today. Some of us are still trying to wake up and get to the building. Others of us are here and still trying to wake up too. Maybe one of these days we'll get that time change all figured out. Always sneaks up on us. Well, I am going to be looking at 2 pages with you. 2 pages. 127, 128. And that sounds like, well, we're going to have a really short class. We're going to have a normal class, I suppose, we'll say. And what we're going to do is remind ourselves of the timeline a little bit. But we're also going to be reminding ourselves of the 12 apostles. We have started looking at the great Galilean ministry of Jesus. It's there in the middle in those reddish areas right there. So we just finished talking about what's called the early Galilean ministry. And it is the middle Galilean ministry in which a lot of significant events occur, including the first one we're going to be looking at, Jesus selecting the 12 apostles. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, hasn't he already? Didn't we read from Luke 5 and Matthew 4, and we saw that Jesus called Peter, Andrew, James, and John? Well, yes, he did. And prior to that, he had those 4 men, most likely all 4 of them, as his disciples, as recorded in the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, as well as Philip and Bartholomew, or Nathaniel, as John calls him, possibly. A lot of questions. We have more questions than answers sometimes. So how long had Peter known Jesus? Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and some of these others. How long had they known Jesus when he actually selected them to be his 12 apostles? A while. A year, maybe longer. And that factors in because what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today is how these men, when they were called by Jesus, they left everything and followed after him. That's what Luke 5 verse 11 tells us. They left everything to follow after him. What other events can you see there on the screen or on the chart in the book if you have that? What other major events occur during the middle Galilean period? The Sermon on the Mount. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to take one class session to look at Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Jesus is getting serious about his ministry. Not that he wasn't, but he is spending a lot of time teaching. What we saw last week, how just in one day, Jesus was constantly on the go. Marc chapter 1 shows us Jesus on the move, going late into the night when he is praying, early hours. The apostles find him, or the disciples as they're called at the time. They find Jesus and he says, look, this is what I came here for. Let's go. And he's constantly on the go. Just a couple of events are highlighted there. Stilling the stormy sea, the limited commission. By the time of the limited commission, the apostles have learned how to perform miracles. They've listened to Jesus a lot. What is Jesus doing during his ministry? Part of that is training the 12 apostles, getting them ready to go into all the world and do exactly what Jesus was doing during his ministry. That's something to keep in mind. Jesus was led by the Spirit. Many times the Spirit is emphasized in Jesus' ministry. What's going to happen to the apostles when they begin their ministry in Acts chapter 2? The Holy Spirit is going to come upon them and enable them, help them to preach. So far, we've looked at the early Judean ministry as presented in the Gospel of John. And now we're moving into the major part of the Galilean ministry. Just a few months into the early Galilean, and now into the middle Galilean. And the time period that we're looking at today is probably around June or July of AD 28. The date I take for the crucifixion is AD 30. A lot of folks say, well, maybe it was AD 33. But I am convinced it's AD 30. That's the date we're going to stick with. And to try to help us with a time frame, we're going to say this is just a couple years before Jesus died. So we're a year into his ministry, his 3.5-year ministry. We're moving along. And Jesus now is going to call these 12 men to be his apostles. I'm going to throw this slide up real quickly to remind you of how much the whole Galilean ministry is emphasized in all 4 Gospels. I've already showed you this slide a couple of times. But you can see Matthew and Mark, over half of the Gospel of Matthew and over half of the Gospel of Mark focuses on the great Galilean ministry. And Ricardo, what are the 3 parts to the great Galilean ministry? There's the early ministry, the middle, and the late. Aren't those wonderful names? It just helps us to break it up a little bit. And what event begins the middle Galilean period? I clicked accidentally there. What begins the middle Galilean period? The selection of the 12 apostles. Jesus is getting serious about training the 12. By the way, in Matthew and Mark, they spend a tremendous amount of time on 1 week, and that's not even including the Galilean ministry. What week in the life of Jesus would that be? The last week, before his crucifixion. Of course, then there's a period of 40 days after that. So what that means is Matthew and Mark spend a lot of their time just on the Galilean ministry. How important does that make these events then, in your mind? This is the focus. There's a lot that happens here that we need to pay attention to. Speaking of Galilee, there is a map in the book. You can look at most any map. And what you have in Galilee are 2 regions. And the northern region is called Upper Galilee. See if I can highlight that word there. Upper Galilee. And then down here you have Lower Galilee. Now, I guess I didn't use a bright enough color there, but there's Nazareth. Tell me about Nazareth. What's special about Nazareth, which is in Lower Galilee? What's so special about Nazareth? That's where Jesus was raised. It's not where he was born. He wasn't born in, okay. And there were people who kept getting confused about that. How can this be the Messiah? Because the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem, Micah 5, verse 2. Because they think, well, I mean, this guy's from Nazareth. So there's Lower Galilee. By the way, the capital of Galilee is Sepphoris. And it's right there, and it's never talked about in the New Testament at all. The focus is on Jesus, not on Galilee per se. And at this time, Galilee is its own country. And it is ruled by one of the Herods, by Herod Antipas, who also rules Perea, and that will play a factor. In the New Testament, when you see the name Herod, it never identifies which one it is. Well, it does when it's Herod Philip and Herod Antipas being contrasted with each other. They're fighting over Philip's wife. Okay, that's another story. We know that with John the Baptist. But most of the time, it's Herod Antipas. And he's the ruler in Galilee. And that should make sense to us because he rules Galilee. That's where Jesus is working. That's where the area where he is. And Perea, that's where this dungeon was, where John the Baptist will end up being held and eventually killed. So we'll get to that later. I've highlighted 2 other regions here. This time they're in Upper Galilee. And can you see Cana and Capernaum? We've seen these 2 places mentioned a lot, especially in the Gospel of John. Jesus performed 2 miracles in Cana. The first one was turning water to wine, John chapter 2, and then healing from a distance. You remember it was the man who traveled from Capernaum to Cana, to have Jesus heal his son from a distance. That's what ended up happening. So there's some points of reference, I hope. Capernaum becomes a main area for Jesus to be. That's where Peter, Andrew, James, and John have their fishing industry. That's where they have their home, Peter's home. And that becomes a major stopping point for Jesus, his base, you might say. And I referenced this just a moment ago, how busy Jesus was in Capernaum that whole day. He started in a Capernaum synagogue. He goes to Peter's home, which is in Capernaum. He spends the evening healing. Healing. Okay, all right, we got to fix that. And just kept right on. Capernaum, extremely important location for Jesus. Capernaum is where he had his confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees over the man who was let down through the roof. And Jesus said, what did Jesus say? Instead of rise, take up your bed and walk, he said that later. But what did he say first? Your sins are forgiven. And last week we emphasized the growing hostility toward Jesus. It's really happened. It happened during the early Galilean ministry. And it carries over into the rest of his ministry. The Pharisees are critical of Matthew. Why? Jesus called Matthew to be his disciple in those parallel accounts there. Why were the Pharisees so upset about Matthew becoming a disciple? Because he was a tax collector. He worked for the enemy, for the Roman Empire, and he threw kind of we'd say a party in honor of Jesus, and tax collectors were there, and the Pharisees said there were also prostitutes, sinners. These are the kinds of conflicts Jesus had. Who was right, the Pharisees or Jesus? Jesus, hands down. We emphasized that last week. And there's a confrontation. It seems this is actually in Judea, but the Pharisees and John's disciples are critical of Jesus' disciples because they did not wash their hands, one of those traditions. On the chart, I will continue to emphasize there are 4 Passovers listed. 3 of them for sure. John 5 verse 1 does not clearly identify this as a Passover. But how often did the Passover occur? Once a year. The last one will be when Jesus dies on the cross of Calvary during the Passover. He is the Passover lamb that dies in our place. And what John does very helpfully is mark the years of Jesus' ministry. And as you can see from the chart, it's about 3.5 years. Here we are. The Passover would typically be in April. And a moment ago I said we're in June and July. So can you see how the second arrow is a little bit to the left of the start of the middle Galilean period? I've gone over all that because I think it's important to try to help us get the timeline firmly in place and understand where we are. We looked last week at Jesus calling the 4. We want to get to the number 12. But last week we talked about the calling of the 4, and who would those 4 disciples be who would later become apostles? Peter and his brother Andrew, and then their fishing partners, James and John. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Chronologically, it seems not long after that, Matthew is called to be a disciple. That's not recorded until Matthew 9. But you have the call of the 4. Now what we're going to look at is the call of the 12. And there's a couple of places we can look. One of them is Mark 3. Why don't we turn to Mark 3? And then immediately after, that's not true. The way it's presented in the Gospel of Matthew, it seems that the Sermon on the Mount is right after the call of the 12. But Jesus is definitely getting very serious about his ministry. And this is what Mark 3, verse 13 says. Jesus, he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And we'll stop there. Anybody here able to recite their 12 apostles? Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas. Why do we call James, the son of Alphaeus, James, the son of Alphaeus? To distinguish him from James, the brother of John. There are a lot of James running around. A lot of James running around here too, I guess. The name James, by the way, it's really interesting how it derives from Greek into Latin into English, but it's actually the name for Jacob. Not a James per se, but Jacob. All right, so what are we looking at next week? The Sermon on the Mount. Right now, we're going to focus for the remainder of our time on the apostles. Tell me this. What is an apostle? I mean, you've got run-of-the-mill disciples of Jesus. So what's the difference between a disciple and an apostle? What is an apostle? A select disciple. He's special. He's got a brighter halo, maybe. Oh, no, only Jesus had the halo. That's right. So the term literally denotes somebody who is sent on a commission. You're sending someone on a commission. I'm sure you've heard that definition from time to time. These are special. There are 12 apostles Jesus chooses, and they're going to be with him a lot. Now, as Jesus travels throughout his ministry, see, he was traveling, see that? As Jesus travels, he has the 12 apostles with him, but it seems he also has an entourage. There are many disciples who are traveling as well. Same thing with Paul. Sometimes we get the impression it's just Paul by himself, or maybe just Paul and Silas. There were other people with them, constantly going and traveling. You had some of the women, Luke emphasizes, that supported Jesus financially. And they would have met with him, especially in Judea when he was there. So we're not always told everybody who's there, but most of the time it's going to be the 12 apostles. Why 12? Why not 10 or 7 or 13? Well, 13 would be unlucky, so no, I can't do that. Say that again? All right. You say 12 tribes. What do you mean by it? What does Gus mean by that? God's covenant people consisted of the 12 tribes in the Old Testament. Now, does that mean then that the 12 apostles, there's one from each tribe? Well, no. By this time, it's kind of hard to tell whether you were from the tribe of Asher or Simeon or Issachar, because those northern tribes have been carried off into Babylonian captivity or Assyrian captivity. That's not the reason why. For example, when Moses selected the 12 spies, where was each spy from? One of the 12 tribes. That's not what's going on here, because these guys aren't necessarily from all 12 different tribes. So this number is important. Why, do you think? We're never told specifically. Now, there are some advantages to having 12 disciples. You're going to be able to send them out in 12 different directions after Jesus ascends, and these men are supposed to carry on his work, his mission. You can also send out the apostles in pairs. In the limited commission that will be near the end of the middle Galilean period. Jesus sends out 70 or 72. He sends out a bunch of disciples to begin practicing doing exactly what they're going to be doing once Jesus leaves. Preaching, performing miracles, and he sends them out by two. Is there an advantage to that? Yeah, they're able to support each other. And so that was wise of Jesus also. So that's a lot of folks. In fact, when you go over to the book of Acts, what do you see in Acts chapters 3 and 4? Who are the two apostles who began preaching right and left in Jerusalem? Peter and John. Peter and John take the lead there. 12 apostles. We can speculate about why exactly 12, but I think we're on good footing. This is representative of the nation, of God's covenant with his people. And these 12 apostles are constituting the restored nation. In fact, they are at 11 apostles in Acts chapter 1, which is beyond what we're going to talk about in our study on the Gospels. What do? They said, oh, well, we've just got 11 apostles. Let's get started preaching to all the world. They had to restore an apostle, somebody to replace Judas. And who was that? Matthias. Very good. Very good. That's about all we know about Matthias, by the way. All right, here are the 4 lists in the New Testament of the apostles. We're going to start talking about the apostles. Tonight, we're also going to have a little discussion on the apostles, but then you're also going to be making application, Larry. At 5 o'clock, Larry takes some topic that we have discussed, some angle, and amplifies it. And tonight it's going to be about our dedication to Jesus. Typically, a rabbi would have a group of disciples, but they still kept their occupations. They would meet with him, they would study, but they still had their own lives. That's not true of these apostles, is it? They left everything and followed Jesus. This was a full-time deal. That is unusual, apparently. Here are the 4 lists: Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, John, well, wait a minute. Acts 1. How come John doesn't list any apostles? I don't know. But he doesn't. The Synoptic Gospels do. And again, I think this is in part because John does not emphasize the Galilean ministry like Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. The list of the apostles is only given in the Synoptics. And who wrote Acts? Luke. Very good. Luke wrote Acts. And here are those lists. I'm gonna first present the 4, and then the final 8. What do you notice first about the list of the first 4? Okay, number 1, it's Peter, Andrew, James, and John. What did you say? Peter is listed first. Peter is listed first. What about Andrew? Is he always in the same order? He is not. Now, what is the connection between Peter and Andrew? They're brothers. Are they are James and John brothers with Andrew? Well, no. They are brothers with each other, though. So you've got 2 pairs of brothers here: Peter and Andrew, James and John. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, long before the Galilean Ministry started, it was Andrew who was a disciple of whom at first? John the Baptist. And Andrew, when John said, "Here is the Lamb of God," pointing to Jesus, Andrew went and found someone and said, "Hey, I need to bring you to meet the Messiah." And who did Andrew go and find? His brother Peter. That is not recorded in the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's in that different gospel, in the Gospel of John. Sometimes Andrew gets 2nd place, other times 4th place. Is he being demoted? No. But let me ask you this. You look at Mark and Acts. Mark and Acts. Did I see a hand there? Did you raise your hand, sir? Okay. Better be careful. Who were the three apostles who at times were singled out as being with Jesus to the exclusion of the others? Peter, James, and John. And I think that's what's going on there. Mark is simply emphasizing that these three men sometimes were part of, all 12 were part of Jesus' inner circle, but there's an even smaller circle. Peter, James, and John. What were some of the occasions when these men are singled out? And the transfiguration in the garden when Jesus is praying 3 times, let this cup pass from me at the end of his ministry. The other apostles are close by, but it's actually Peter, James, and John who are in the garden at a distance, and they couldn't stay awake. Very interesting time that we'll get to at some point. And there's another that I can think of. I'm sure there are probably a couple of others, but those are 2 of the 3 main ones. Remember Jairus, when he had the little girl who had died, and Jesus took 3 of his disciples or 3 of his apostles into the house with him, and that was Peter, James, and John. So there's this close connection apparently. You think Andrew felt slighted? Why I'm the one who found Peter in the first place. He could have been doing other important stuff. Okay. We don't know. We don't know how Andrew felt about this. But it is interesting, the order here. James is typically listed 3rd, but in Mark's account, he is listed right after Peter. And I don't have an answer for why, per se, other than Mark is emphasizing Peter, James, and John, and the same thing with Acts. For sure, Acts. We don't know much about Andrew, but the emphasis is placed on Peter, James, and John. And then notice that Peter and John are listed together in Acts. Why is that? What's going to happen to James, the brother of John, in Acts 12? He's going to be killed. And I think Luke, at this point, at the beginning of Acts 1, is emphasizing the close connection between Peter and John, the work they're going to be doing together. I hope that'll help us remember some events in these books, in these Gospels, and just kind of interesting. And then the same thing with John here. John's listed closely with Peter in Acts 1. He is always mentioned in close connection with his brother James. When James was killed in Acts 12, how did John, his brother, react? What does the text say in Acts 12? When John was killed by Herod Agrippa the first, and a new Herod by that time, what did John do? Did he cry? Did he get mad? You don't know this? Why not? Because the New Testament doesn't tell us. Not a peep. Now, how do you think John the Apostle reacted when his brother James was assassinated? I'm sure he grieved. Do you think he questioned his faith? We just don't know. You say no, but how hard would that be? The persecution was real. This is the first apostle to be martyred. He's not the first apostle to die. Who was the first apostle to die? Judas. All right, by his own hand. Who is always listed first? Peter. Why? Because he's the leader of the 12. He's later going to be the first hope. Okay, we won't go there. And I'm going to talk about Peter in my sermon today. I'm sorry, I just couldn't help myself thinking about this lesson. And as far as being the Pope, I don't know a lot about Catholicism, but I do know that the Pope is not supposed to be married. And not supposed to be married. And Peter had a mother-in-law. What does that tell you? And in 1 Peter 5, Peter is talking about how he is a fellow elder. In order to be an elder, you have to be married. You have to be the husband of one wife. I don't believe Peter was the vicar of Christ on earth. He is a natural leader, no doubt about it. Jesus, you remember in Matthew 16, when Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said, "I'm giving the keys of the kingdom to you." And it's singular, it's Peter. But then what do you see in Matthew 18? Jesus talking to all the apostles, and he says, "I'm giving you the keys of the kingdom." Is Peter special? Sure, absolutely, he's special. But is he more significant than the other apostles? Does he have more authority? I don't think so. I don't think so. He is the one who takes the lead on the day of Pentecost, and he is a natural leader. And I think sometimes when Peter confesses this or Peter says this, he's actually just saying what the other apostles are thinking. It's not that they didn't agree Jesus is the Christ. They just didn't say it themselves. All right, we could spend all day just talking about Peter, but let's move on to some of these others. So I've divided the list, the remaining 8 apostles, into 2 groups of 4, and I think that's a natural division. You've got Philip at the head of the second set of 4, and then James, the son of Alphaeus, at the head of the third set of 4. Notice who's always at the end: Judas Iscariot. Except in Acts 1. Judas is not mentioned as an apostle in Acts 1. He's dead. Okay, all right. What do we know about Philip? Okay, he was one of the disciples of John in John 1. Who was his close companion? Who was his buddy? But that's not what he's called. Nathaniel. Is it possible that Nathaniel, as he's called in John's gospel, is not Bartholomew in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? It's possible. John never mentions Bartholomew, a Bartholomew, and the other books here, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, never mention somebody named Nathaniel. I do believe Bartholomew and Nathaniel are one and the same, but we really don't know. We don't know much about these guys. What else do we know about Philip? Is he the one who, in Acts 8, left Jerusalem and went to Samaria and preached to the Ethiopian eunuch? And, okay, no, I'm not trying to ask you a trick question. I'm trying to emphasize that's a different Philip. And so we call this Philip the Apostle. And we distinguish him from the other Philip by calling him Philip the Evangelist. And this is the Philip who had 4 daughters who prophesied, and he lived in Caesarea Maritima, and that's where Peter interacted with them. What else do we know about Philip? One time, or a couple of times, he's mentioned in the Gospel of John, the most famous one, I think, in John 14, when, I'm going to get myself confused here because they're so rarely talked about, but he's the one who says, "Show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us." And then Jesus rebukes him and says, "How long have I been with you, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" John 14, 8 and 9. We don't know much about these guys. But Philip heads that list. We've already talked about Bartholomew. We know very little about him. Tell me about Thomas. And you see how the order is a little different. But tell me about Thomas. He's doubting Thomas. Bad. Doubting Thomas. What is it that Thomas wanted in John 20? What did he demand? Proof. I will not believe that Jesus is raised from the dead unless I see the imprint of the nails in his hands, he said, and the piercing of his side. And he should have had more faith, shouldn't he? Well, I'll remind you of something. The other 10 apostles demanded the same thing. It was just the week before. They also were extremely skeptical of this person who stood among them The room was shut and there was no way to get in, and yet all of a sudden there's Jesus standing inside the room. Isn't that interesting? And in John 20, all the apostles needed that same proof. Doubting Thomas. I think we give him a bad rap. I want our young people to not simply accept what we tell them at face value. At some point when they're young and they're learning, that's great. But at some point, we need to develop our own faith. We don't need to just say, oh, well, everybody else says it's true. It must be true. Yes, ma'am. More noble-minded than those at Thessalonica. Right. Thomas, and by the way, it never says that when Thomas saw Jesus there in John 21, that he said, okay, let me see the imprint of the nails there. Let me see it. Yeah, okay, all right. What does it say? When Thomas saw Jesus, and Jesus said, you don't believe? I'm offering it to you. And what did Thomas do instead? He confessed. He said to Jesus, my Lord and my God. Thomas got the point. And it wasn't even Peter who said at that point. It was Thomas who said, you are God. And so that was an ultimate post-resurrection appearance. I am so excited to study with you all the post-resurrection appearances, but it won't be for a long time. We're going to finish this quarter. We're in March now. March, April, May, we're going to spend here on the Galilean Ministry, and then we're going to take a break for just 3 months. Larry's going to teach 2 Samuel. He doesn't know it yet, but that's what he's going to do. No, I guess, yeah, that's right. You will. And you remember Larry taught 1 Samuel? He taught it with the high schoolers, young adults, and he wrote material, many times more than 4 pages. And it's going to be published. What do y'all think of that? So we may be studying it again. So you need to start working on 2 Samuel. And then we are going to look at the Perean ministry, the late Judean ministry, and the last week of Jesus' life. And I know this is an ambitious study. I hope it'll be very helpful for us. But those post-resurrection appearances are so powerful. And we're going to take a close look at them. I'll remind you, but we're going to be getting to that. It's going to be fantastic. I hope you're enjoying this study of the life of Jesus. So here's this fellow, Matthew. What do we know about Matthew? He was a tax collector. And Jesus called him to be his apostle, and he left everything, or disciple at the time, and left everything and followed Jesus. What else do we know? What was his Jewish name? Levi. So that's interesting. We may not know much about Philip, Bartholomew, and Thomas. Very, very little. We know a lot more about Matthew. What did he do for us? He wrote the Gospel of Matthew. He was a tax collector. A lot of scholars will say, well, the Gospels, they probably were written 30, 40, 50 years after the events that they record. And I always have questioned that, and there's a handful of conservative scholars I've seen who also do. If Matthew's a tax collector, what does that mean he's able to do? Read and write. Who's to say Matthew isn't writing down, recording some things? We don't know that he is. We don't know that he isn't. And his gospel may very well be very early. They keep record. We have no way of knowing for sure. Be that as it may, I just laugh when I think these scholars who are very well educated, they just insist. They've got that herd mentality. Oh, this must be right. And I just don't know that that's necessarily true. All right, I better hurry here. James, the son of Alphaeus. Why is he called of Alphaeus? We already answered that. To distinguish him from the more famous James, you might say. James, the son of Alphaeus. I'm glad your mother is not here. She would rake me over the coals if I started talking about James the Less. I don't think James, the son of Alphaeus, is James the Less. Don't think he is. But why would James be called James the Less? He's if not an apostle, just a disciple, run-of-the-mill disciple. A lot of James. He may have been shorter than some of the other Jameses, probably because he was younger. James the Younger might be a better translation. All right, James the son of Alphaeus, I do not believe is James the Less, but just simply to distinguish him. Thaddeus is mentioned only twice. Only twice, Matthew and Mark. Why is that? Because Luke doesn't call him Thaddeus. What's the name that Luke gives him? Survey says Judas. Not the son of Iscariot, though. The son of James. We already had too many James going on here. Isn't that interesting? Thaddeus, his other name, his Jewish name, is Judas. Do you know what Thaddeus means? No, it doesn't mean Judas. Doesn't mean betrayer or anything like that. Twin. Thaddeus, I guess, was a twin. That's really all we know about him. No. Thaddeus and Judas are one and the same person. I guess I'm glad you said something there. Oh, sorry about that. Simon the Zealot. Does that mean he's the son of Zealot, Mr. Zealot? What is a zealot? It's a sect of the Jews, and what do zealots want to do? Overthrow their government. And we speculate and say, well, is this somebody who basically said, okay, I'm going to stop doing that? And then you got a tax collector. I'm sure you've heard this many times. You got Matthew the tax collector working closely with Simon the Zealot. That's like oil and water, isn't it? You got somebody working for the Roman government. You got somebody who's part of a group that wants to overthrow the Roman government. What about Jesus? What did he want to do? He did not want to overthrow Rome, but he did want to establish God's reign on earth, his reign on earth. Yes, sir. Yeah. And the gospel is able to unify us for a common purpose. Now, another reason why he's probably called Simon the Zealot is because there is another Simon in the list, and that was Simon Peter. All right, we are out of time. Let me just throw up there. Judas Iscariot is only mentioned 3 times. And who is the one who replaces him? That would be Matthias. Okay. And because we're out of time. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, not James the Less, Thaddeus, Simon, Judas. And he was replaced by Matthias. Okay. Our class is finished. James is the first to be martyred, and then Paul will be the apostle born out of season. I wanted to do this. Come on. Uh-oh, what happened to my song? Yeah, go back. Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Next came Philip, Thomas too, Matthew and Bartholomew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon also Thaddeus, 12 apostles Judas made, Jesus was by him betrayed. Matthias then took Judas' place to preach to men of every race. Paul 3 preaching trips did make, and went to Rome for Jesus' sake. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them. Yes, Jesus called them. And they all followed him. Now you know the names of the 12 apostles. You going to lead that song this morning, Cody? I already did. Okay. Next week is, next week is the Sermon on the Mount. Boy, we're not cooperating this morning. You must be a zealot. How dedicated to Jesus are you? That's tonight's application of our study. These men died for Jesus. What are we willing to do for him? Thank you.